They drift into your life quietly, sometimes cloaked as old friends, wounded lovers, anxious colleagues, even family. They speak in concern but sow confusion. They smile, but it feels like a mirror reflecting someone else's sadness. They pull you into their orbit not with chains, but with sympathy, need, guilt, obligation. And yet, they leave you hollow. There is a moment, maybe you've lived it, when you step outside a conversation and suddenly feel drained, as though your soul had been on mute while your body nodded along. You stare into nothingness, wondering why your chest is heavy, why your thoughts feel borrowed, why your joy, so accessible hours ago, now feels distant and foreign. This is not just social fatigue. It's not just overexertion. It's psychic erosion, a slow bleed of the invisible parts of you. But here's the paradox. These energy drainers are not monsters. They are often the ones we feel compelled to protect, the ones we say yes to, the ones we make excuses for. We tell ourselves, they're just having a hard time, or they don't mean to do it. And maybe they don't, but that's the genius of their hunger. It hides behind our empathy. You sense this already. You felt it in the pit of your stomach, in the way your intuition tightens when their name appears on your phone. And yet you answer, because society taught you that love is unconditional, that kindness is infinite, that boundaries are walls, that protecting your energy is selfish, that saying no means you're cold, unkind, unavailable. But let me ask you this. When did martyrdom become morality? When did exhaustion become the price of connection? When did absorbing others' chaos become a virtue? We live in a world that celebrates hyper-accessibility. Be there for others, always, or risk being labeled toxic, uncaring, or not emotionally safe. But in our compulsive giving, have we asked, at what cost? What if protecting your energy is not a betrayal, but an act of sacred rebellion? What if every yes that drains you is a form of quiet self-abandonment? Look deeper. Why do you flinch at the thought of cutting ties? Why does guilt appear faster than clarity? Why do you second-guess your boundaries until they are nothing but suggestions whispered through clenched teeth? It's because you've been conditioned to conflate empathy with self-erasure. You were taught that being a good person means being endlessly available, even to those who make you feel spiritually bankrupt. But is it truly compassion if it costs you your vitality? There is an ancient wound in the heart of modern empathy, a wound that bleeds. In silence, camouflaged by performance, we perform understanding while swallowing rage. We perform care while screaming internally for space. We perform strength while secretly collapsing under the weight of everyone else's chaos. This is not love. This is spiritual codependency, and the emotional vampire thrives on it. Some do it intentionally. Others do it unconsciously, but all of them have one thing in common. They intuitively sense that you don't know how to guard your energy, and in that void they enter. And perhaps the scariest part is not their existence, but your quiet consent to it. How many times have you sacrificed peace to keep the peace? How many times have you betrayed your intuition to avoid making someone uncomfortable? How many times have you poured into someone who never once asked how full your cup was? You see, the vampire doesn't need to bite you. They only need you to forget yourself. And so the question emerges, not from intellect, but from existential urgency. What is the worth of your presence, your inner vitality, your emotional clarity? And who gets access to it? Not everyone who reaches for you deserves to hold you. Not everyone who cries near you should be comforted by you. Not every wound is your responsibility to bandage. So here you are, caught between the moral ideal of being good and the metaphysical truth of being whole. Which will you choose? Before you answer, look around you. Take stock of the fatigue that clings to you like second skin, the unspoken resentment tucked behind your politeness, the loneliness that grows even in crowded rooms. These are not random emotions. They are signals, warning signs, echoes from the deep. And yet, what if there was a different path? One where compassion is not cannibalistic. One where connection doesn't cost you your core. One where guarding your energy is not cruelty, but the highest form of spiritual hygiene. We must go deeper. We must unravel the roots. We must expose the architecture of this invisible theft. Only then can you reclaim your energy, not through retreat, but through profound redefinition. The threat of the emotional vampire is not born merely from their hunger. It emerges from a far more insidious origin. You're training to feed them. This is not about blame. This is about programming. From the earliest moments of life, you were taught to attune to the needs of others. When you cried too loudly, the world frowned. When you gave too little, the world withdrew. Approval became a currency, and you learned to earn it with compliance. Praise arrived when you were agreeable. Love seemed most abundant when you were useful. So, somewhere along the line, you began equating worth with sacrifice. But who decided that your soul was a resource to be extracted for others' comfort? The roots of this lie not just in your upbringing, but in the architecture of civilization itself. Western society has long upheld the myth of the selfless giver, the empathic martyr, the tireless caretaker, the saint, the hero, the strong one. But beneath these myths is a subtle coercion. You exist for others. Psychologically, this is reinforced by the inner child still begging to be enough. Carl Jung warned of the shadow, the repressed aspects of the self that we hide, deny or bury. And perhaps one of the most common shadows is the hidden rage of the overgiver, the person who smiles through depletion, who cheers for others while dying internally, who silently asks, "When will someone pour into me?" But to admit that resentment would fracture the identity you've built. You've learned to protect your image of goodness at the expense of your truth. And so the emotional vampire thrives, not because they overpower you, but because you've been groomed to surrender. Jung also said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The unconscious belief that you must be endlessly emotionally available, that's the spell. That's the trance. That's what keeps your energy vulnerable to siphoning. Friedrich Nietzsche once declared, "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you." But what if the monster isn't out there, waiting to devour you, but within you, disguised as virtue? What if your compulsive empathy is just a shadow of your fear of abandonment? Consider this. Schopenhauer saw the human condition as inherently full of suffering, and much of that suffering, he argued, came from our will, our desires. We long for meaning, connection, validation, and in doing so, we hand over pieces of ourselves in the hopes someone will return them whole. But people don't return what you sacrifice. They consume it, and when they're done, they ask for more. Aldous Huxley wrote about a dystopia of pleasure, where people were pacified not by fear, but by comfort, addiction, and the illusion of connection. In many ways, emotional vampires offer this very illusion. They come with stories of pain, of need, of trauma. And you, trained to respond, to soothe, to fix, fall into their gravity. You begin to confuse urgency with intimacy. You begin to confuse guilt with guidance. You begin to confuse enmeshment with love. What if the reason emotional vampires find you is because, deep down, you're afraid of being untethered? What if the identity of healer, helper, listener, or fixer is the very disguise that allows your soul to be siphoned without resistance? Jean-Paul Sartre believed that hell is other people, not because people are evil, but because relationships demand a constant performance of the self. You begin to see yourself through their eyes, shape yourself through their gaze, respond to their needs before even acknowledging your own. In this theater of being, your truest self becomes obscured by the roles you play. And Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of the Holocaust, reminded us that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. But what if your space, the sacred interior, where that choice is made, has been infiltrated? Emotional vampires manipulate that space. They collapse your boundaries with stories. They exploit your instincts by creating urgency. They override your intuition with narratives that appeal to your guilt. They don't steal your energy with force. They let you offer it. That's the hidden problem. Not that emotional vampires exist, but that you've been shaped to believe your energy isn't fully yours. Let that land. You were not taught to ask, "Is this my responsibility?" You were not taught to wonder, Am I abandoning myself to meet this need? You were not taught to pause and check if your inner well was already empty before trying to fill someone else's. No, you were taught to show up, to care, to stay, even when your soul screamed otherwise, and society rewarded you for it. You got applause, validation. You were called generous, kind, irreplaceable. But beneath those compliments was an insidious transaction. You give, and we will call you good. So now, when you think of stepping back, of choosing yourself, of guarding your energy, the panic rises, not because it's wrong, but because it threatens the very identity you've been applauded for. But ask yourself, what is the price of continuing? Because there is a quiet despair that settles in the soul of the overgiver, a spiritual erosion that no one else sees, but you feel every night when the world goes quiet. It's the ache of having nothing left to give, yet still being asked for more. And that ache is the soil where the emotional vampire thrives. The time has come to see clearly, to unravel the myth that your value is in what you offer others, to question every voice that says boundaries are rejection. That solitude is selfish. That saying no is cruelty. To reclaim the idea that your energy, your peace, your clarity, your vitality is not a public utility. It is sacred territory. But first, we must understand the true cost of letting this continue. Because what you lose in the process is far greater than just your energy. It's your identity. And unless we confront the unseen consequences, you will keep calling this slow death love. We go there next. You don't notice it at first. The theft isn't loud. There's no dramatic confrontation, no clear betrayal, just a subtle unraveling, an erosion of the self, so silent that it feels like weathering instead of wounding. But over time, something in you begins to dim. You second-guess your instincts more than usual. You feel exhausted after simple conversations. You dread social interactions, not because you dislike people, but because they feel like arenas where your soul is slowly siphoned. You start canceling plans, not for rest, but to preserve the shreds of your inner clarity. And here's the terrifying part. The world tells you this is just adulthood, just stress, just burnout. But it's not. This is what happens when your psychic immune system is compromised, when your boundaries are treated like invitations, when your yes is assumed before it's given, when your silence is interpreted as consent, when emotional vampires roam freely in your life, cloaked in the illusion of friendship, family, or intimacy. You don't see the damage because it hides behind socially sanctioned roles. She's the strong one. He's such a good listener. They're always there for everyone. Compliments, yes, but inside them, a prison. The unspoken expectation to always be available, to always give, to never flinch, falter, or fight back. And slowly, your inner world starts to collapse. You begin losing touch with your desires, not because you don't have them, but because they no longer feel important. Other people's needs grow louder, more urgent, more justified. Yours? You bury them under a growing mountain of shoulds. You should be more understanding. You should stay longer. You should help, even if it costs you. This is the mind's silent submission to spiritual colonization. Cognitive dissonance sets in. You feel one thing, tired, resentful, distant, but act another way, engaged, kind, receptive. The more you suppress your truth to maintain peace, the more fragmented you become. Your identity becomes a performance of expectation rather than a reflection of authenticity. Neuroscience confirms this fragmentation. The anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain responsible for detecting internal conflict, lights up like a distress flare every time your actions contradict your inner truth. But you learn to ignore it, to silence the alarm. Over time, this creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, a state where you begin to feel powerless to change your environment, even when escape is possible. This is how emotional vampires win. They don't just take your energy, they make you question your right to keep it. And the consequences aren't just emotional, they're neurological, physical, even spiritual. You start having trouble sleeping. Your dreams become crowded. You wake up more tired than when you went to bed. Your nervous system, constantly activated by subtle emotional invasions, begins to operate in chronic survival mode. Your amygdala, the fear center, becomes hypersensitive. You feel unsafe, even in familiar places. You become reactive, anxious, withdrawn. And still, the world calls you kind, but inside your soul is folding in on itself. Your creative impulses diminish. Joy becomes suspicious. Silence becomes threatening. You keep waiting for space to be given to you, to rest, to say no, to reclaim, but it never comes. Because the truth is, no one gives back what you gave away unconsciously. And let's be clear, not all emotional vampires are cruel or malicious. Many are wounded. Many are operating from their own trauma, their own unresolved chaos. But that doesn't change the consequence. Their damage, untreated, becomes your burden. Their emptiness becomes your responsibility. This is what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the burnout society, as a culture where we internalize the demand to perform, to give, to always be on. But what he points out is striking. Burnout is not caused by external oppression, but by self-exploitation. And emotional vampires, knowingly or not, amplify this process by persuading you to participate in your own depletion. Over time, you may begin to forget who you were before the fatigue, before the code switching, before the constant managing of other people's emotional storms. You start mistaking your exhaustion for your personality. You start mistaking your tolerance for strength. You start mistaking your numbness for peace. But these are not traits, they are symptoms. Symptoms of a life lived on the defensive, of a nervous system constantly bracing, of an identity sculpted around survival, not sovereignty. And then, something even more sinister happens. You begin attracting more of them. Why? Because energy follows attention, and boundaries broadcast frequency. When you leak energy without consequence, you signal to the world, I am available for this. Emotional vampires are not stupid, they are attuned. They find the unguarded, the overgivers, the ones whose spiritual doors are always slightly ajar. And once they're in, they don't just drain you, they begin to shape you. You become more agreeable, less honest. You start to censor your needs, to soften your truth. You laugh when you want to scream. You stay when you want to leave. You apologize when you've done nothing wrong. And piece by piece, your soul gets edited for other people's comfort. Until one day you look in the mirror and see a version of yourself that's polished, agreeable, and completely hollow. And here's the worst part. No one notices. Because you still smile. You still show up. You still perform the rituals of connection. But inside you are gone. Not dead, but dispersed. Scattered across 100 conversations you didn't want to have. Spread thin across 1,000 emotional crises that were never yours to hold. You've become a ghost of yourself. Not because of violence, but because of slow, consistent surrender. And now the choice is here. You can continue. Keep giving. Keep absorbing. Keep collapsing, or you can rebel. Not with anger, but with clarity. Not with cruelty, but with sacred refusal. But to do that, you must be willing to burn the script you were handed. The one that says your worth is what you give. The one that says boundaries are rude. The one that says being loved means being needed. You must become dangerous to the systems, internal and external, that trained you to be compliant. And that journey, it begins with the rebellion. Not out there, but within. There is a quiet moment, one not born from rage, but from clarity, when you finally whisper to yourself, no more. Not in defiance of others, but in allegiance to yourself. That whisper is the beginning of rebellion, because the most radical act in a world that thrives on your depletion is not anger or escape. It is presence with boundaries. It is the refusal to trade your essence for approval. It is choosing yourself again and again, even when it makes others uncomfortable. Emotional vampires cannot survive without access. Cut off the access and the illusion collapses. But here's the paradox. Your liberation doesn't start with saying no to them. It starts with saying yes to the parts of yourself you've long silenced. You have to recover your original self, the version of you that existed before the people-pleasing, before the guilt-based giving, before you were conditioned to measure your worth in emotional labor. And to do that, you must unlearn the lies. Lie number 1. Boundaries are barriers to love. The truth? Boundaries are the conditions of authentic love. Without them, love is just manipulation with better branding. Boundaries aren't walls. They are doors, with locks, handles, and thresholds. They determine who gets in, how far, and on what terms. Lie number 2, kindness means availability. No, kindness means truth. It means alignment. It means not becoming a participant in your own exhaustion just to soothe someone else's discomfort. If your kindness requires self-betrayal, it is not kindness. It's self-sacrifice in disguise. Lie number 3, if you don't help, they'll fall apart. And maybe they need to. Maybe their growth requires them to meet their own abyss. Maybe your constant saving is delaying their evolution. You are not the protagonist in everyone else's healing arc. You're not here to be a spiritual crutch. Breaking free requires discomfort, not just for them, but for you. Because when you stop being the rescuer, the fixer, the dependable emotional sponge, something terrifying happens. People react. They guilt you, they rage, they weaponize your past kindness. They tell you you've changed, and you have. Because change isn't just external, it's metaphysical. It's the moment your energy field shifts from open source to sovereign territory, and it shakes people. That's the price of reclamation, losing the version of you that made others comfortable. But in that loss, something holy emerges. You begin to move differently, speak differently, think differently. You start asking radical questions like, does this serve my highest energy? Is this my responsibility or my conditioning? Am I being present out of love or obligation? You become discerning, not just with people, but with time, with conversation, with what you allow to enter your psychic field. This is not selfishness. This is energetic discernment, a skill, a practice, a spiritual muscle, and it must be trained. Like the Stoics who mastered their inner state regardless of external chaos, you begin to realize the only real freedom is internal sovereignty. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." That's the root of the rebellion. The emotional vampire loses power when your energy is no longer up for negotiation, when your attention is no longer currency, when your emotional labor becomes invitation only. This means your no becomes holy. Not harsh, not hostile, just clean. It's the clarity of saying, I see your need, but I will not betray myself to meet it. It's the pause before responding, the space where guilt rises and is met with wisdom, not surrender. Because now you understand, guilt is not a moral compass. It's often a relic of conditioning, a residue of your past self, trying to maintain a role that no longer fits. And with each act of resistance, you begin to build something far more powerful than protection. You build energetic integrity. This is the frequency that repels the vampire, not with cruelty, but with incompatibility. They sense it. You're no longer porous, no longer shapeable. You no longer respond to emotional bait. You no longer offer explanations for your distance. You no longer negotiate with need. You exist in your full presence, and that presence is no longer for sale. And what's wild is this. The more you anchor in your energy, the more people respect it, even if they don't understand it. You become a mirror, a reminder of what is possible. You stop attracting the needy and begin attracting the sovereign. You start connecting with those who feed you, not drain you. You find conversations that leave you full, not foggy. You find spaces that honor your silence. You find relationships that don't need you to be exhausted to prove your love, because you have changed your frequency. This is not about avoiding all emotional labor. It's about choosing it consciously, offering your energy from overflow, not depletion. Like Viktor Frankl taught, that sacred pause between stimulus and response becomes your superpower. You no longer react, you respond, you choose, and in choosing, you reclaim your life. You begin to write new scripts, ones where connection is mutual, not transactional. Ones where your energy is sacred, not spent. Ones where your identity is not a reaction to others, but a revelation of self. This is the rebellion. And it isn't loud. It doesn't always look brave. Sometimes it's just the quiet act of stepping away, letting the phone ring, choosing solitude, saying, I'm not available for that right now. And in doing so, you become something rare in this world. A sovereign soul. Unshaken, undrained, unafraid. You stop dancing for affection. You stop bleeding for applause. and you begin to walk, firm, quiet, whole, into a life that no longer requires your disappearance. But this is only the beginning, because there is one final truth left to face. A truth that will not just explain the journey, but reframe your entire existence. Are you ready to see it? To confront the ultimate, most haunting realization? Then come with me. We end where all revolutions begin, at the root of reality. There is a truth so unsettling, so liberating, that once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. It is not merely a solution. It is a severance, a death of illusion, a quiet apocalypse of the self you thought you had to be. It begins like this. No one is coming to protect your energy, not your family, not your partner, not your therapist, your spiritual teacher, your community, no one. They may care, they may try, but they are not you. They are not inside the cathedral of your being, where your soul echoes with every choice you make. You are the only one who can hear the subtle violations, the micro-betrayals, the slow drip theft of presence, and until you become sacred to yourself, you will always be for sale. That is the ultimate truth. All this time, you weren't just being drained by emotional vampires. You were outsourcing your sovereignty, hoping someone would grant you permission to stop giving, hoping someone would understand your exhaustion and intervene, hoping the world would notice and say, "You've done enough. You can rest now." But the world will not say that, because the world feeds on the compliant. It thrives on the ones who say yes without question, who bend without breaking, who shrink themselves in the name of peace. And so, if you want to be free, truly free, you must become your own sanctuary. You must become someone who holds themselves in such reverence that the idea of being emotionally manipulated becomes absurd. This isn't ego. This is divine remembrance. You were not born to be consumed. You were not born to be endlessly needed, endlessly accessed, endlessly explained. You were born to burn, clean, bright, whole. But somewhere along the way, you forgot. You traded your fire for warmth. You began dimming your radiance to avoid making others squint. You started believing that spiritual maturity meant being everyone's emotional landfill. That being enlightened meant tolerating what your body screamed against. But true wisdom, it does not bleed quietly. It roars in the language of self-ownership. It says, "I will not be emotionally colonized." It says, "I will not negotiate my peace." It says, "If I am called selfish for protecting my essence, so be it. I'd rather be condemned whole than praised hollow." And when you step into this awareness, something extraordinary happens. You begin to radiate a frequency that emotional vampires cannot penetrate. Not because you hide, but because you are no longer open in the wrong ways. Your openness becomes directional, intentional, sovereign. Your love becomes an offering, not an obligation. Your presence becomes a gift, not a guarantee. You no longer chase harmony in the shadows of your own silence. You begin living from your core, not your coping mechanisms. And from this core you see clearly. Every time you withheld truth to preserve connection, you gave away a piece of yourself. Every time you allowed guilt to override your intuition, you participated in your own disappearance. Every time you said yes when your body was screaming no, you rehearsed your own extinction. But now you know, and with that knowing comes grief. You grieve the years lost to self-abandonment. You grieve the parts of you that were never allowed to speak. You grieve the relationships that only thrived when you were not fully alive. Let that grief come. Do not bypass it with affirmations or silver linings. Mourn it like a funeral for your former self. Because that self, so tender, so loyal, so desperate to be loved, carried you as far as she could, but she cannot take you where you're going. Where you're going, the currency is truth. And truth, real truth, is terrifying, because it severs, it shatters, it strips you of the masks you wore to survive. It forces you to stand alone before you can stand whole. But from that loneliness, something holy emerges. Not just a stronger you, a truer you. One who knows that your energy is your birthright, not something to be bartered. Not something to be negotiated down to please others. You begin to realize you were never here to be needed. You were here to be known. And anyone who cannot meet you in that knowing, without draining, guilt-tripping, or contorting you, was never your home. They were your lesson. You don't hate them. You don't curse them. You see them for what they are. Lost souls trying to feed through connection, and you bless them. But you walk away, not to hurt them, but to heal yourself. And in that walking away, in that return to self, you complete the journey. You are no longer a victim of energy theft. You are a guardian of your own sacred fire. And that fire, it is what will light the way for others still trapped in the fog. They will see you, feel you, wonder how you did it, and you will tell them, not with sermons but with presence. You will say with your eyes what your lips never need to utter. I remembered who I was, and I chose me, not in spite of others, but in devotion to what is real, what is holy, what is untouchable. So let this be the final severance. You do not exist to be drained. You do not exist to be convenient. You do not exist to be consumed. You exist to burn, to illuminate, to stand as an uncompromising force of presence in a world addicted to access. That is how you guard your energy from emotional vampires. You remember, you reclaim, you rebel, and then you rise.